Okay, hello there. So we are going to go through with a real strong focus here on teaching methods. Again, the focus here is on thriving. We're really shifting the goalposts, really shifting a paradigm, to be perfectly honest. Students are no longer seen as pre-employees, and education no longer stops at just the right answers, right? So we move from pre-employees to thriving, supportive, democratic community members, and we move education from just a set of right answers as the end goal to being very contribution oriented, uh, and that's our end goal. Okay. So with that in mind, before I get into all the methods and all, I'm going to set this up just a little bit. I'm not going to use every single method with this, but let's pretend that I'm working on creating a unit that does this. The unit is a critical analysis of subtle racism in pop culture. Now, this might be something that you would see in an art class. Might be something that you would see in an English class. Maybe it's something you see in a drama class. So you have some room here as what kind of course this would be situated in, but nonetheless, I'm obviously picking a very overt topic. So the focus here is on subtle racism in pop culture. It's not sort of wham bam hit you in the head kind of racism. It's more of the sort of microaggression style of racism that you see a lot all throughout various, unfortunately, all throughout various media, right? So you'll see as we get into it where we're going. So let's assume here that the questions for the unit are: to what extent is racism expressed in subtle ways in pop culture? Of the ways that subtle racism is expressed in pop culture, to what extent is there a pattern in its presentation? And then the third question there: to what extent is there a pattern in its topics? So how it's presented, oh, that's an interesting little question there, right? As well as the topics of racism that show up, okay? So you might just say, well, racism, isn't that its own topic? Well, sure, right? But then there's going to be these other sort of sub relationships and ways of performing subtle racism that pop up. So, uh, and like I said, I don't have this like fully fleshed out as a complete unit here. We'll see just sort of some dabbling in it as we go along. So you see the objectives based on those questions, and they're very much a one-to-one relationship here, right? First objective goes with the first question, second one with the second one, third with the third. So students will be able to analyze and explain the extent to which racism is expressed in subtle ways in pop culture. Students will be able to determine patterns of how subtle racism is presented, and students will be able to determine patterns of specific topics of subtle racism. Okay. Now, I talked about this before in a previous video about lesson planning and unit planning, but just to, it's here as a reminder because I feel like we oftentimes really benefit from seeing things a few times. The way in which a whole unit is organized is through these four different phases. The first phase focuses on this sort of initial exploration of the content and various concepts or skills, right? It's not just content. But anything that is going to be touched upon in the unit itself, this is this time very well spent where students can do a lot of exploration around what they know and would also need to do some kind of presenting around it. Okay? Now, when a teacher has done that part well with students, deeper exploration of the content or skills or and concepts, all of that will take place with a lot more guidance from the teacher. Okay, this is the point here is that we're not just throwing out that the leadership of the teacher. There's times when it's really needed, and as we get into something more more deeply in the content area itself, obviously the teacher's leadership is going to be really important here. Phase 3 is students going really even deeper into the content, but in their own way. There's choice in this. What do they want to do? What aspects of the content do they really want to focus in on? And there's a bit more self-pacing going on here, not in the purest sense where, students don't have a deadline. I mean, we still have a deadline, but it's something where they can self-pace themselves a bit more. And then phase 4 is bringing that out to the community so that there can be a really valuable experience at the community level talking about these topics and seeing how it affects their community and perhaps what can even be done. So throughout this unit, there's this mixture of these 4. So you have the 4 phases that I just mentioned. And then you have these 4 different approaches to teaching. Are you doing it for a critical-based reason, for a path-based reason, for a contribution-based reason, or a community-based reason? And these things are going to overlap. That is okay. The idea is that we're being really mindful and intentional of the kind of work that we're doing with our students. So the critical-based kind of teaching is using various critical lenses of analysis, like critical race theory, eco justice, feminism, heteronormativity, to, and more, right? To deeply view an issue in general or in a community. And the point here is to see it all from different angles, not just one particular perspective. Now, these are all critical lenses of analysis where they're looking at issues of power based on various kinds of relationships that they're emphasizing. Race, gender, sex, sexuality, relationships with nature and all that. That's what these lenses of analysis really mean. So when you're doing that critical work, what you're doing is asking students to continuously change their lens of analysis to see what happens from the different angles. A path-based approach, that's we're connecting to the ways in which students have this sort of deeper purpose about themselves in their life, right? Who am I? Where am I going? What am I trying to accomplish in life? As far as I can tell at this moment, right? Not that these things don't change, they certainly can. But also connecting the content in some way with their paths. And sometimes it's just a simple question of where do you think your path and this content sort of meet up, right? If they do at all. And maybe sometimes we don't see it right away. The third thing is contribution-based, and that means that the ways in which a student can sort of offer something to a community. What can their contribution be in a way that potentially moves a community to become more thriving? Not that any one particular student would necessarily have that, huge impact, but it's contributing towards that. So the contribution is the thing that they offer. Their path is their larger sense of who they are and where they're going in life. And those two things are very much connected because the more we understand our path, the more we understand our strengths, and the more that we can really offer something in the way of a contribution. And that also means really knowing ourselves in relationship with the community and the needs of the community and so forth. It's very complex, but that's the kind of understanding that we would want to build over time. And last but not least is the community itself. Are you doing this work in a community-based way? In other words, are you learning from the community? Are you focused on providing contributions to the community? So those are sort of the two main ways that we do that. But when you look at these 4, sort of critically understanding something, connecting with our path, thinking about and perhaps making contributions and doing so within the community, sort of critically understanding it generally, and then critically understanding it within our community itself, because it might have a different dynamic. That's what we're aiming to do here, right? All of this with the guidance of a framework that's built on the ideas of thriving theory. So you see that there. Individual, collective well-being. This theory focuses on how we can keep increasing our own well-being, how we can become more and more observant and thoughtful of the interconnections between socio-eco sustainability as well as ourselves in connection with that. and then how we can democratically contribute towards that thriving community, right? So thriving theory, at least in the way that I've been constructing it, has those three main parts there. Something that a framework's really important. You can always go back to it and say, to what extent am I really making that kind of connection with the work that we're doing here, and where does it fall within the framework itself? Which of the three am I focusing in on at the moment? And that can change. The emphasis can change depending on what you're teaching. So it's not like you have to do all of them all at once. Really, this is much more complex kind of teaching than just sort of getting kids to get to the right answer and wondering why they're not cognitively engaged. Why? How could that possibly be? So anyway, so here you see this sort of critical-based approach, sort of putting it back in this hypothetical unit that I've made up, this critical analysis of racism. So the critical-based teaching would be focused on identifying subtle racism in pop culture examples. The path-based teaching would have students sort of discussing how being able to identify subtle racism is connected to their paths, which, that might not always be obvious to them. Why are we doing this? And how does this connect to who I am and how I think? Contribution-based teaching in this unit, it would really look at two different things here. One is sort of based on the research of what's going on in the community. We would find specific ways to really counter the subtle racism that's affecting our community, and really counter it with specifically anti-racist revisions of that pop culture. So I'll get to lots of examples of how that gets done. Now, the community base itself, I've already alluded to what that part is. So part of it would be just doing the research of how our own community responds to subtle racism, and it could be a wide range from not even realizing that it's happening to, quite aggressively and vigorously going after it. So, sort of understanding where our community sits with this topic. And then the second part, because community is always a two-parter, learning from the community and then providing to the community, right? So giving, so learning from and a giving to. So providing a community experience that introduces subtle racism in pop culture and discusses ways to support each other, especially community members who are often targeted, right? So there's a lot of potential there. So, when we look at the lessons, lessons in general have an initiation phase, an activity phase. You work with various ways in which to differentiate that learning experience so that it's meeting the needs of your students. You have some kind of assessment going on so you understand what your students are even getting out of it. And, if you really want that lesson to drive home a clear understanding, you do some sort of closure that, we're not great at closure. We oftentimes blow right past it or don't include it at all. But the closure here would be looking at that content or skill one more time and seeing how students do with it. So it's in its own sense, it's just, sort of like the final assessment in the best possible way, not in a standards-based, high-stakes test or, getting tests to death kind of way, right? So I'm going to sort of jump to the end here. What do we mean by community engagement? And I think it's really important to start here, because when we really think about what the overall experiences can be at the end, that's what we can work towards as we're thinking about the way in which we're teaching and how our students are experiencing learning, sort of what the purpose of the learning is for them. So these are not meant to be sort of an exhaustive list, but when we're researching the community, so this is still not the full extent of where things go. This is learning from the community so that we can do something more meaningful with the community later on. So how can we engage with the community and actually learn what they know, how they understand things, and what's going on in our community? So you have various kinds of interviews here that you can do with all kinds of different people that are in in your community. Uh, Observations at all kinds of different places in your community. So you do like a case study, right? You could really look at more. The purpose of a case study is to look at something very specific and go deep with it and try to understand it at the deepest levels that you can, as opposed to just doing these great big sample sizes, which also give us a different kind of data. Both are valuable in their own right. You could do an ethnography, which is sort of like a cultural thick description, meaning it's a bit complicated, but how you would do it with kids is it would be very observation driven, and really noticing things all in a very um, uh, isolated space, or maybe not isolated, but um, a strongly identified space. So, for instance, you could go to the mall, right, and just do kind of regular observations, or observations of what, right? Or you could go to the mall, the same space, and really pay attention to as many things as you can all at once to see how they're interwoven with one another. And if you're doing that, especially if you're being very aware of sort of cultural patterns, if you're at that level, you're probably doing something like an ethnography, which is pretty in depth. That would, for teachers, that would take some uh, learning about, because you're probably not, as a teacher, your research methods is not, something that you have a depth of knowledge in. It's usually something reserved for folks like me who get a doctorate. But you get the idea here, right? We can do some basics with that kind of research that I think would be really powerful for kids to just dabble in, right? Participatory research, meaning the students have an experience and they're part of that experience, so they're reporting on their experiences with it. Demographic research, so really looking at this kind of makeup of who we are based on various categories, and there's the obvious ones: race, class, gender, sexuality, and then there's other categories that we can certainly make up and see how that makeup of whatever categories you're focusing on, how it exists in our community. Obviously, there's a literature research that can be done. There's field trips and reverse field trips. So, having lived through a pandemic, reverse field trips are when a teacher goes to a site and then provides a media experience or artifact collection or something to that extent, rather than everybody going there all at once. This can be a much more directed kind of thing. Put it on a video and watch it in class, or bring things back to the class. But there should be some. The way at least I'm intending for it is that the reverse field trip is that it really, at least part of it should occur at that particular site. Okay. So even though it's just a teacher that's there, they need to be there, and some of that space needs to be seen for the students. If that makes sense. Anyway, all right. We have a lot to get through here, so bear with me. Now, contributing to the community, there's some things that we already do, like art exhibits, that are, good. Like, this is great, right? But what if we change the intention or deepen the intention of what they're for? So you can have art shows with, the art shows always tend to have a theme anyway, right? But if they're geared towards making us more thriving, there's a lot that we can do here, whether it's things like installations or public art. We can do eco art, we can do murals, street art, we can do guerrilla art, which is art that just sort of happens on the fly and tends to be really thoughtful kind of things. You'd have to keep it legal, of course. Anyway, we're talking about kids, right? Whole different story if you're an adult. You do your thing. Poetry slams, critical performances. I'm going to get into something called forum theater. This is a huge one that we could do. But the way in which we do plays and musicals and musical performances, all of these can have this intention behind it as well. Not just things like inclusion, so great that we're moving into that space more, but really about how our community can thrive better. So we could create video games, simplistic ones, of course, right, that deal with some of these tensions and these difficulties. So something that, let's say, you're inclined to do that as a teacher, then this could be something that there more than one unit, all right, units are all adding to this, because this would be a long kind of endeavor, right? As I said before, Theater of the Oppressed, so critical performances. There's various things that happen here in Theater of the Oppressed, like form theater. I'll talk about that more. Cop in the Head, Corporation Head, Rainbow of Desire, Image Theater. We could do reports and publications that go out to the public, and then of course we can make our own documentary films and more. So these are just some ideas of what you can do. I will talk about, right now, I'll talk about the ways in which we can create these community conversations and the various levels that they can exist at. So you have what I'm calling a council, which is led by students. The first part of it would sort of initiate experiences with community. So this could be an after school event, an evening event where loved ones, parents, and guardians, and just anybody from the community can go to. You don't have to have kids, but you can go and see kind of what's going on. And students would, do something that would initiate these understandings and get these topics rolling. So what do we do then, right? So, okay, we understand in this case, we're doing something along the lines of, critical understandings of subtle racism. What would we be doing with that, right? So we might start by showing a scene from a movie, or displaying some art that comes from the media, right? Just to initiate those kind of understandings. Anyway, so student contributions, let's say that they had their projects were really focused on this topic, right, this unit, and it leads them to create what I'll call anti-pop. Anti-pop is pop cultural style media that pushes on the problematic messages of regular pop culture. So, they could now start to, you have these sort of initiation experiences, and then they have these contributions that they're doing that came from their projects. And it deepens, as we're sort of seeing students doing this kind of work as the folks in the community, the thing that we're seeing now is sort of like, wow, look at how the students are working with this particular issue. And then students, right, with the help of teachers, are running a deeper exploration of these issues, some sort of activity or experience of us being together that may lead to things like breakout groups where people have time to sit and talk with other community members about the issue that they're focusing on. And then we come back into this more whole group setting and look at sort of the data patterns. What I mean by that is, if you had folks in small groups discussing things, we would then share out some of the ideas and then look for patterns of what the various groups are saying, and to see like what collectively are we saying together. Not to say that it's in unison or all the same stuff that we're saying, but to look for the patterns. Patterns can also be contrasting patterns, and that's okay too. In fact, it's really helpful, right? And then if this is an issue that requires this kind of work, to start doing a whole group deliberation around it. I mean, this would be a pretty potent night, right? This would be a few hours long, 2 to 3 hours long. This is not something that would just be sort of like a quick, get in and get out. Oh, hey, look at my kid's stuff. This is awesome, right? And there's a little presentation, and then off we go. Yeah, right, homebound, right? This is actually for the purpose of supporting our community, right? So it's not a show and tell of student accomplishments. It's a genuine attempt to work with our community and help with a particular issue. Okay, so that's sort of like what I'm calling a council night, and that is just a starting place. You might be thinking to yourself as a teacher, like, oh my God, how much does he want us to do? That's a lot of work already. Yeah, I know. It is, right? Um, but think about where this goes. When it moves from student led to community led, now you have all kinds of work being done there, starting with sort of revisiting students' intentions, and students would be following up. And this would be at a different time, right? This would be something that the community decides to take up on its own, and maybe it's a town council kind of thing. Maybe it's a different community organization. Maybe it's sort of ad hoc. It just happens on its own, and something that's people are willing to jump in on and help with. Anyway, it could happen in a million different ways, but the point here is that it continues in the community. And when that does happen, it would be incumbent upon that organization, whatever that organization is, to really revisit the students' initial intentions of why they brought this work at all, or maybe not so much why, because maybe it was teacher initiated at the very 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 beginning, but what students really brought to this topic, to this issue, and to start there. What was that night like? What was council night like? What happened? Did we? And I just forgot to mention this deliberation in the council night could lead to a plan for action on some level, right? So now at the community-led experience, there's a revisiting of the students' initial intentions and then reviewing that plan. The plan may be very simple. Let's get together as a group and talk about whatever. So reviewing the plan and then thinking about of it like, yeah, is that enough? Do we want to do more? Maybe we do, right? And again, if students are there, they can chime in and sort of share their thoughts with adults in the community about what and why and how and what it's all about, right? But the community itself really does start to take over in the best possible way with students supporting and potentially being part of that, I think, at this level. So there would be more, consideration, deeper consideration. There would be its own form of deliberation. Again, with students present and able to make comments and sort of say, oh, that's not how I meant it, or well, I'm glad it went this way, but this is where it started from, or whatever. And then a fuller reporting back to students, because maybe not all students are there, but some way to go back to the original students in school and say, here's where we are right now, right? So keeping that line of communication open. Now, of course, there's a third potential, which is that you could have communities talking to each other. So what I'm calling communities conferencing. So not just one community, now communities, plural, talking to each other on these issues, right? So you can have students meeting with community organization, and then that community organization, the original one, that in the community conferencing, community singular conferencing, when they met with the community for the community conference, now we're the communities conference. So students, meeting with the original whatever the organization was the first time, to sort of go over what are we doing here, what's the point, and being part of that. Again, not to the point where students are steering it and leading it, but just to be a part of that experience, which I think is really important. And then obviously that community now meets with the other community or communities, or organizations from, maybe within the same town, but maybe across different towns, or maybe it's another part of the world even. Discussing experiences, right? The communities are discussing the experiences with similar issues and collaborating and deliberating, and again, reporting back to the community and to students. That's the sort of thing that would kind of happen. So you can see how this it goes from just a singular topic, um, within a unit, and then moves to the larger community, and then communities working on this together. That's pretty powerful, right? So there'd have to be a lot of buy-in at the community level to do this kind of work. But my point is just that this potential is there. Okay, and over time, this is something I would think that a community would want to be part of. And they have their own business to attend to, not just what school students are telling them to attend to, but I think there's a very empowering aspect to this, where oftentimes students themselves are the ones who really point to something that's very important that's possibly not being attended to, right? So that's the overall intention here, which is huge. Now, if this is the larger goal, if this is what we're really trying to teach towards, that's very different than just teaching towards a set of right answers and then moving on to another unit or another topic. This is much more about really being actively part of life, and it really counters the way in which we are oftentimes seeing ourselves in these very limited ways, where we don't see ourselves as an important voice within our own communities, right? So more on that, of course. So here we are, initiation. Well, what is initiation really about in terms of thriving? But it's framing the learning experience. That's what initiation is here for. And there's a lot of ways to do this, but it's about really revving our sort of cognitive engines with something that's interesting, relevant, real world connections, community connections, and individual experiences, right? And there's a million ways to do that. So I'm not going to say that every single way that I have here, I've thought it all out to the fullest extent. The point here is really just to help you think about how you go about doing these things if you're aiming towards thriving. So set up the frame of thinking. Now, you can pause this video, go to the slideshow itself, and click on this. This is one scene in the movie Dumbo from 1941. And this goes to the larger issue that I'm teaching about, the unit plan, right? The subtle racism. So you can pause this video, go over and click on that, and you'll see the lyrics, which are epic. Oh man, good old 1941 Disney, right? Okay. So hopefully you were able to watch that video, and that's really important. So if you haven't, I'm telling you, pause it, go for it. Now, initiation, the actual experience itself can be a whole range of methods. I have 10 up here right now, but it's not just these 10. Okay, I'm going to go through all of them in some capacity. But just know that when you do initiation, all you're basically doing is a fairly abbreviated activity to get things going. If you have a 45-minute class, 5 to 10 minutes, that kind of thing. And it's just to kind of get things going. Now, you can be in phase 1, what I'm calling initial exploration, and still do an initiation while you're in phase 1, right? You can initiate the lesson, even though the lesson is students independently working on things, right? So you can start with the topic, you can start with a quote, you can start with an idea, you can start with a problem in community, and go there and help them do their own. I gotta move this chair. I'm gonna get hit by sun. See, woo. Anyway, sorry. I know, weird video, right? The production value of this video is questionable, to say the least. Okay. So, the point here is that you do these sort of small, abbreviated versions, and then they set things up for the rest of that lesson. So let's get into some methods. Okay. The first one I'm bringing out here is something I call thrive punking, and it's based on steampunk, in a somewhat parallel way. So if you're familiar with steampunk, right? Okay, I'm totally geeking out right now, so bear with me, right? Steampunk is based on the Victorian age, and if we futurized the style, the aesthetic, the technology of the time, but if it stayed analog and never went digital, what would that look like? Okay, so look it up if you don't know what steampunk is. It's pretty cool. It's pretty interesting aesthetic. Okay, as with anything else, you can see various ways in which some problems remain. Maybe there's a patriarchy there, whatever. But that's the point here is that punking something, steampunk, uh, punking something is an actual process. Okay, you don't have to just do it like steampunk. You can do it with really kind of anything, right? So here I am doing thrive punking, and what I mean by that is, if you took some sort of issue and ran it as far as you possibly could and made it as thriving as possible. So this would be something that we do with our own imagination to try to understand it. If you did that, what would it be like? And to be honest, I'm kind of thrive punking education at the moment because I would like to see education go to this deep, meaningful space of teaching towards thriving itself. So I'm kind of thrive punking education. A lot of work, by the way. If anybody else wants to do this, you're welcome to. All right. So the other part of this is I'm caught on things. Yep, I know the production value here. Call the director. It's not my fault. All right. I have this really squeaky chair. All right. You're like, dude, come on, man. This is a very long video. Yes, you're right. So this is our first method. Now, if you think about it in terms of how do you do it with critical-based teaching, how do you do it with path-based teaching, and how do you do it with community and contribution-based teaching, what does thrive punking look like in each one of those? And it changes. Okay, now you can please pause at any point in time and read through this yourself. But the idea is that when we're in this sort of critical-based way of learning, we're probably in sort of phase 1 or phase 2. So you can see that the ways in which those dynamics play out. If we're talking about sort of a path-based thrive punking, how it connects to you or how it connects to the students and their particular paths, that's probably a phase 2 more often than not, and possibly even moving into some sort of phase 3 of project, right, where they're moving their path into that. Now I'll say this as we go through these methods. Phase 3 is something that I don't highlight a lot because, as I said, the real idea here is to have some sort of project where students are led by their own choice, connected to the content, connected to their path, and operating with a contribution in mind. A lot of things to keep in mind here, right? So I'm really more focusing on what happens in phase 1, 2, and 4 more often than that. But phase 3 is really important, obviously. That's where you get your contributions from. So call me crazy, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about things at the moment because I have a lot to say around each one of these methods. So how it looks when we're in sort of the initial phase, phase 1, is really different than how it looks in phase 4 when we're at the community and contribution phase. Now, thrive punking being a very imaginative kind of experience is something that you would want to share with your community, right? The initial process that you went through as a student to thrive punk some content, some issues, you would want to thrive punk the heck out of it in front of the community too, right? So maybe it could very well be that you're just simply providing artwork, right? So maybe it looks something like what Jessica Pearlstein did, right? She thrive punked San Francisco. I don't think she called it that. I don't know her, so maybe she did. Maybe we're very simpatico here, and I just don't even know it. But she did this great piece on retrofitting San Francisco to the point of it being very thrive oriented, right? And I've talked about this piece over and over and over, but did she do an awesome job. And thank you, Jessica Pearlstein, for your amazing, amazing, amazing work. with this piece. It's just obviously a huge source of inspiration for me. So that's an example of thrive punking in general, right? But what about in the unit that this hypothetical unit of subtle racism in pop culture, right? So, maybe this is something that we can look at. We have uh, somebody who has taken Disney princesses and has, not just princesses, right? Because there's Esmeralda there from Notre Dame as well. But the point being, instead of the usual way that we see the Disney princesses, um, it's because it's often very problematic. Um, an artist, obviously superimposing their heads and all of that, made this piece about Black Lives Matter, right? Is this thrive punking, right? Is this showing some sort of version of thriving? Well, maybe somebody would say, and me included, might say, well, if you're protesting the situation, then you're probably not at the space of totally thriving. So that's one way of thinking about it. But another version of thriving could be the fact that you have this shift in roles, and the fact that these characters that so many little kids, especially girls, cis girls, are very attached to when they're growing up. Maybe there's something here that is really pushing on those norms, and maybe just the artwork itself has a level of thriving going on. Okay, so anyway, big discussion to be had there, right? It's a different kind of view of thriving than the Jessica Pearlstein's artwork of San Francisco, retrofitting San Francisco. But you get the idea here, right? We can have discussions around just that alone. So, you know, depending on how we view thriving, having these cartoon characters in this way might be its own form of thriving, perhaps, or it's on the way towards thriving because they're pushing against some sort of issue of injustice. So we're not thriving yet, but we're on the way to thriving. So it just depends on how you're looking at what thriving is, which is great because there is no one version of thriving. I just want to keep putting that out there. I'm not, even though I'm sort of philosophically looking at what thriving is. Another discussion for another day, but short and sweet. There's not one way that we need to lock down on thriving. Again, using the thriving theory itself, I think is a really good starting place to have these discussions and look at all these kinds of nuances. And that's, great, right? We don't have to get locked down. So, another teaching method, what I call the alien researcher. So it's often, I'm going to the blue box there, alien researcher blue box. It's often too difficult to understand ourselves deeply, right? So this mental exercise of pretending to be an alien, really from another planet, who's trying to understand how and why we do certain practices and patterns, that can be of great service, and especially at the very beginning. So how do we know about something? How do we know that we know about something? How is this a practice that we need to keep going with? If somebody pretends to be the alien, and we do this mental exercise of like, okay, explain this to me. I'm not from this planet. How does this work? That's an interesting dynamic to have to keep working with, right? Because a lot of times we'll say something and go, oh man, well, now that I said that out loud, that sounds a little bit nuts. And we might pick up some of those kinds of ways of thinking, like, why do we do this? Why are we doing this? Why do we continue to do this? So, this is very much a phase one kind of method. Not exclusively, right? There might be times when we do them in phase 2 and 3 as well, but I think it probably is most useful in phase 1. Now, phase 4, you could do this again, right? You can role play the alien, having practiced this throughout the unit, really honed in on the project itself, maybe. If you play this role of the alien in the community, whether you do it as like almost like a performance from student to student, so that people can just sort of witness it, or real daring, gotta know what you're doing here, posing it to the community itself. uh, that would be pretty interesting to see what happens there, right? I mean, it's kind of fun, but it'd be really interesting, get the. I use this all the time, but an alien shows up and chooses you and says, "Hey, tell me how things work here," and eventually end up talking about money, right? Well, to an alien, money probably sounds pretty dumb. Why would you do that? Right. And this is what I mean by the effectiveness of the alien researcher. Uh, the alien researcher is like, really? Like, you don't just have access to things. You have to have this fake thing called money to get a real thing, like healthcare, right? So yeah, right. It's a pretty. I think it's a really interesting tool. Okay. So the ways in which that changes over time too. The path-based piece there, considering the alien's point of view, can also help us zoom out and sort of re-examine our bigger reasonings and purposes for why we're doing something. So, I like that. And like I said, not exclusive to phase 1 and 4, but you get the general idea. Okay? So, alien researcher, right? Oh, what's going on with the Snow White character? Tell me the story about Snow White, right? Why is she white, right? Is she named after the color, or is that intentional? Is that you talked about racism before? Is that a race based thing? Do you think, right? Could she have been any color, like what any skin color that humans have? Is that possible, or was there a preference there that we're just maybe not paying attention to? So as an alien, right, somebody who just simply doesn't know what's going on, you have to tell everything to. They could really help you draw out some issues here with race, right? Again, maybe you don't have answers, but it's really interesting to see those things kind of drawn out. Okay. Callouts and questions or claims. Okay. I'll start to go a little bit faster. So, using callouts in order to raise questions and provide claims, right? Raise questions or provide claims. So, this is from a former student of mine who's a teacher. Shared with me he did this with his middle school students, and he has these callouts, and you can they're wipeable, so you can write in them and then clean them. So yeah, he was doing this work with social justice issues and movements and protesting, and so he had students take the callouts and write questions about what they were already thinking about and putting them up on the board and here's your questions, right? So it's the form of a call out, right? A thought bubble or a speaking bubble or some sort of excitement there, and then in this case it was in the form of questions, which would be great at the beginning of a unit, and then at the end of a unit or even in closure, you could shift it towards claims instead of making it about questions. You make it like claims. So and so does this in our society, or this kind of thing is how it happens in our community, or these are the kind of experiences and patterns that we have. Claims, right? This, like, claiming something to be true, and then seeing how people respond to those claims, right? That could be pretty interesting. So again, it's sort of a phase 1, and then anything that you do in phase 1, you pretty much can do as an initiation in phase 4. So that's the kind of pattern, right? And you can see how a community would respond to that. Okay. All right. I just realized something's wrong. I gotta fix the other slide. Oh my god, the callouts and questions claims. I don't know what happened there. I'll fix it. Don't worry. Just realized that. Yeah, I've been working on this for weeks. Okay, sustainability inspector. Students take on the role of evaluating if a practice seems to be sustainable. So, another teacher happens to be my wife now. So she does this at elementary in TESOL. Okay, so if you think you can't do this in your class, think about doing this with students who are still very new to English language. So she did this activity, and she explained better than I can. But basically, she said, like, look, here we have a salad. Let's figure out where all the different parts of the salad came from, and how many miles this salad that's in front of you traveled to be in front of you right now. right? And being that our students are from different parts of the world, obviously this connects to a much more worldly view and has those kind of benefits, right? Where students would be inclined to feel more connected to that, especially her TESOL students. So that's interesting, right? And then look at the addition, that all of the food collectively traveled almost 16,000 miles together to get there, right? And then which one traveled the farthest and which one traveled the shortest. And so you have some, at the elementary level, you have some, pretty high end addition math, all right, going on. That's pretty good. So what are we talking about here? You get the idea. Now, again, this is something that's really interesting because it can be applied and coupled with other methods like cop in my head or corporation in my head, which I'll get to later on. So, take a look at that when you get the chance. Needs assessment. Researching the needs of a community or impact based on community issue. So this is just what it says that it is. All right, doing an assessment of the needs that are within a community. And this can happen at all the different levels, for sure, with different purposes in mind. Okay, so you can take a look at that. Obviously, when it's really initial, when it's just at the very beginning, it's going to be a lot more sort of exploratory. And as you move towards phase 3, it becomes a lot more, it shifts and becomes a lot more in depth and much more well supported, not just exploratory. And then, of course, bringing that out to the community in terms of a community exploration with it, right? Council night or something like that. Like, you want to make sure you're on top of your game and you got this down so that it's not, flimsy, but that it's actually well done. Okay, so it goes from being sort of, very open, inquisitive, to being very pointed and well supported as you move through the different phases. Power windows. So this is what I was talking about earlier, this sort of shifting of specific lenses of analysis to keep looking at practices and relationships of power and how they're impacting thriving. Negatively impacting could be how it's going. It could also be positively impacting thriving, right? But using these lenses, so as I was saying before, critical race theory, we can use greed ideology, as I've talked about it in other videos, heteronormativity, eco-justice, feminism, semiotics, whole different discussion for another day, existentialism, and so forth, right? So there's a lot here that you can use. Obviously, as a teacher, you have to get familiar with these lenses of analyses. You don't have to use them all at once. Maybe there's 2 or 3 that are really useful. Maybe somebody else wants to use one that you haven't even thought about using. So anyway, the point here is to constantly keep shifting, like almost like when you go to the eye doctor, where they keep sort of changing the lens to see if you have clarity. This is like, okay, here's the race lens. What do you think? How much of this are you seeing, right? Oh, through the late race lens, I can see these relationships and these issues pop up. With the feminist lens, it looks more like this. From heteronormativity lens, it looks like that, and so forth, right? So yeah, but you have to really support your students and give them a lot of clarity of what each one of the lenses does. So, as a teacher, you'd want to demonstrate that for a while before you just sort of hand it off to them. But it's something that you can definitely do. And, I know an English teacher who does that very often with students. It's part of the way in which they analyze stories. Okay, so power windows. Obviously, if you do this at the community level, that becomes pretty awesome too, right? Having people go from one lens to the other, you're helping the community see things in a much more powerful way. And, a phase 3, I don't actually have it written there, but a phase 3 would be really important because we want to keep a high level of awareness of what lenses, what critical lenses that we're using as we're doing our project too. And as you're doing your project, shifting a lens to see if you're actually doing enough for that particular project, right? So here we go. Maybe instead of using it for Thrive Punking, maybe use this image for Power Windows. Because when you look at their signs, you see that there's a bit of a different emphasis on each one of the signs. They're not all the same, right? So here's an example of some more subtle shifts in critical lenses, but nonetheless they're there. Okay. Power washing is different than power windows in the way that it's really about analyzing patterns and concentrations of power and envisioning more diffuse, spread out democratic power in those situations, in those practices. So power washing is another kind of imaginative experience, kind of like thrive punking, but it's very specific on how power is concentrated within a community or a practice or experience or something to that nature, right? And thinking about how that power needs to be more fairly distributed. Moving pictures is using a collection of images and having students arrange them, rearrange them, tell stories with them. But the point here is that you have these images. You could do them sort of how they relate to one another. Are they oppositional? Are they supportive? Can you create a story out of them? Okay, you can go in all kinds of different directions here. Again, doing that at the community level would also be really interesting to see how the community responds to that at the council night, let's say. So here's an example, right, of lots of different scenes or scenes from different movies, and some analysis, right? I brought back in the same picture with the protesting, but you can see a meme on the bottom with Aladdin, as the extent that his skin color seems to change when he's poor and being a criminal versus when he's more successful and royalty and all that. Now, you can also confront it and be like, well, wait a second, they didn't do this right, they should have done it this way, or whatever. All of that's up for grabs here, right? The point isn't about being right. It's very rarely ever the case. The point is about being thoughtful and intentional and seeing what comes up in those thoughts, okay? But you can give these images to students and have them arrange them in patterns, have them arrange them with similarities and regroup them. Like I said, tell stories. You can, the image, just having the images together in a collection and organizing and reorganizing them with different intentions is, again, another good initiation to get things going. It can certainly be the main activity as well, but it's a real good, interesting way of getting things going. So moving pictures, right? Counterparts. Using images that either are complementary or oppositional to critically analyze content and issues of thriving. What? Okay, so you have two relationships here that you're really focusing in on. Are they complementary, like a bolt is with a nut, where they're made for each other? Okay, it's complementary. Or are they oppositional? They go against each other. Oil and water are oppositional to each other. So you can, figure out. I mean, you can, as a teacher, you can give them things almost like moving pictures style, and figure out what are the relationships that are there. And out of those relationships, are they complementary or are they oppositional? There's a lot of discussion to be had there. The reason why we're doing these kinds of activities is because just doing straight up analysis is really difficult for most people, especially kids. So these are different ways to engage kids in analytical thinking. Moving pictures, counterparts, sort of thrive punking. It's also a version of analysis. It's imaginative, but you have to kind of look at what's here right now and analyze it, and then reimagine it based on that analysis. So there's a lot of analysis going on here with all of these different activities. Okay, so if in the beginning you're like, I gotta get kids to analyze things, like that's a really hard thing to do. Probably simpler than you think, right? Because here's a lot of methods that are going in that way. And here's yet another one, art for finding meaning. So let me bring you through this one a bit more. Transfer our lives in the community. Okay, so here is the Starry Night by Van Gogh. And so the question here would be, so what do you see, right? And what I typically hear from students are, the very swirliness of the texture. There's a lot of movement in the parts of the painting that are nature based. So you have that kind of dynamic going on. When you look at the two main vertical structures, you have the church steeple versus the tree there. I think it's a juniper, if I remember correctly. And so there's a real big contrast in size there, obviously done on purpose. Van Gogh, as any artist, is often very deliberate in terms of what the visual is there. So we can sort of ask the question, hey, what's going on? Why is one so small and the other one is so big? And at first it's like, well, the juniper is in the foreground, so it's just a proportional thing, right? It's just because it's closer to you. It's a proximity thing, I mean. So, okay, cool. Let's move on, right? No, hang on a second. Hang on. Right? There's a real story here, and there's meaning behind what's going on. And a lot of people are just happy to look at the piece, right? It's a very popular piece. So when I was in Museum of Modern Art in New York City, where this painting is, there was a docent going around leading a tour, and I happened just at the time to be looking at this painting because it's one of my favorites, as it is for a lot of people. And the docent stopped there and started to have a discussion around what this painting was about. So this is the only way that I know any of this, to be honest. So the docent was very clear in saying, like, look, none of this is sort of written in stone, but we know Van Gogh's background a bit, and we know kind of what his pattern was and how this potentially fits in with his pattern and his experiences. So very quickly, Van Gogh, he applied to be in a seminary, right? And he got rejected. So obviously that was something that had an impact on him, to not be accepted into this religious seminary. Obviously, he was really thinking about dedicating his entire life to religion. So that's an interesting element here, right? How does that potentially play into this painting? Well, you have nature being the real big focal point and force of energy here. Everything that's nature-based is super flowy, right? Big strokes. And then when you look at the town itself is a little bit more sort of fixed lines. It doesn't have nearly that kind of same energy that the rest of the painting has. That's all, 80% nature-based. And then when you look at the vertical structures, there's something more interesting going on, because in the town itself there are some lights on, right? But the church, which is pretty centered in the village, has no lights on, right? So, is that significant? Again, it's an artist doing something very deliberately. It might very well be the case that because he was rejected from seminary, over time he really shifted his spirituality to not be so religion-based, thus the lights being off, to something more nature-based, with all of the textures and all of the movement, right? There seems to be this narrative here about how wonderful and vibrant the nighttime sky is. And it's of no mistake that there's a church there without the lights on, and it's a way smaller than the juniper. So the juniper didn't actually have to be there. Again, as a painter, you can do whatever you want. But he made this point to have this giant vertical structure that is off-center, but it's really penetrating into the nighttime sky in a very significant way. It has this, it has as much of a presence in a way as a nighttime sky does itself. Whereas the church has like the teeniest bit of the steeple that kind of touches into the nighttime sky, right? So Now you might say like, hey, how do you know this for sure, right? If he hasn't said it out loud, how do you know? Well, we don't. But given that he also has that experience in his own life, and it's something that we can sort of speculate on, right? Now, why did I go through all that? Because artists put meaning into their work a lot. Sometimes it is art for art's sake, and that's wonderful. But a lot of times you see there's a lot more meaning in artwork, and here may very well be a piece that we oftentimes just appreciate for art's sake and makes us feel perhaps something with nature. But as we start to look into the biography, you see that there's even perhaps a deeper meaning of not just Van Gogh's connection with nature, but he's also calling us to look into our own relationships with nature, right? So there's meaning in this. And that's a pretty powerful thing, right? So if you do this kind of work with your students, if you use artwork to find meaning, that's a really wonderful experience. Now I'm just doing this in a video as a lecture style. I wouldn't do it that way with students, and I have done this in a college classroom, and it's very questions oriented, and I guide them. Right, I know where I'm going with it, but it's something that I like to do because it's a lot more interesting to us to see something through the lens of art than it is to just simply read about it or see some words on a slide that we okay, another bullet point. There's there's a 1,000th bullet point for today, right? Okay, so you get the idea. Now, art for meaning, finding meaning, is a little different than art for critical analysis. Art for critical analysis is a lot of what I've been doing with the Disney art, right? Is to say like, wait a second, what's going on here? So we're critically analyzing it to look for these issues that are popping up, right? There's an issue here, but it's not, he hasn't done something here that's problematic. Okay, so art for finding meaning is different. We're not looking for something that's problematic. We're just looking to see something in a deeper way. Whereas art for critical analysis is we're trying to look at something that is problematic, right? Van Gogh is actually himself potentially pointing at something that's problematic for him. So that might be a little confusing. I understand that. But we're not critically analyzing it to find a problem with something that he did wrong. That's different. Okay? When we look at Dumbo, for instance, we're taking that art and critically analyzing it for the way that it very problematically dealt with racism. Right? It's racist in and of itself, so we're going to critically analyze that art. Right? Okay? So that's more the point here. It's a little bit of a different shift, but that's kind of the intention, okay, is to problematically do that. Media is the same thing, so not just art per se, but any form of media, okay? So it's the same process, really looking for that problem. I've mentioned this before, anti-pop. What I'm calling anti-pop is to create something that calls out the problems of pop culture. It's a very specific form of it, not just analysis that's exposing the art, but or the pop cultural art. It's very specifically creating a counter narrative in the form of pop culture. So let me give you this, right? There's no plausible deniability. So Goofy, the character Goofy, his origins were definitely racist and probably classist too. So obviously, he's this lovable, funny guy. But where he came from was this sort of poor, bumbling person of color who, unintelligent, sort of mumbles a lot, right? Ouch, right? This is becoming pretty problematic pretty quickly. Now, how is this particular piece anti-pop? It's actually very simply where just by putting the text on top of the artwork, there's no plausible deniability, and then underneath it, Goofy's origins were racist. Like that, just the text alone is anti-pop. Okay? Now, if it's just Goofy himself, no. But the text does that. Now, can you do this another way? Does this have to be done just with text? No, it doesn't have to be done just with text. any kind of sort of use of pop culture to make it um, go in the other direction than the problems that it was engaging in is what we're talking about here, right? So now storytelling is a very powerful experience. We do a lot better with understanding content, concepts. When there's storytelling attached to it, it's not just. So I'm not doing storytelling here. What I'm doing is just telling you about a different method, one by one by one, right? But it's not attached to a story. When we attach understandings to a story, when we attach concepts to a story, we have a much better understanding of what they're about because of the different relationships that are in the story and the outcomes and experiences, right? But talking about something abstractly is harder for our brain to remember and understand. Whereas storytelling itself does a lot of heavy lifting. And I put in here, storytelling is an ancient form of teaching. Yes, if you're an oral based society, storytelling is the way that you carry knowledge from, it's one of the main ways that you carry knowledge from one generation to the next. So we remember things better when they're in the context of a story, right? Okay, group teaching. Students work in small groups to be the teachers of specific content selected by the teacher and in cooperation with the teacher. So this is not something that this is something I do often in my courses, right? All my students have had this experience for years. But what I don't see happening often is this at the class level, especially secondary. You folks who teach secondary can really ask students to be responsible for some kind of content and have them do the teaching, and they can use a lot of these different methods as they teach, right? When you ask students to take the time to learn something and teach it, it tends to be a really good experience for them in terms of understanding that content, okay? So there's that. And then there's path-based connections, and then doing this at the community and contributions level is something that obviously they just get better, right? Presenting information and sharing ideas, which is awesome. Questions for community. So this is in the classroom itself. When students are developing interview questions for community members, there's a lot of thinking here that they have to do in order to write really good questions. So this is not something you do on the fly, right? I'm just going to write this question, I want to know this thing. You got to really know what's in that question, what kind of interpretations are going to come out of it, what you mean by it. Writing a question is a lot more difficult than oftentimes we think. You have to be very careful in figuring out what you're actually meaning and what you're trying to get somebody to talk about. They might talk about something very different in connection with that question through interpretation and whatnot, right? Conversations with nature. Conversations with nature is another very imaginative kind of experience. It could be done at all of the phases, and I feel like it's probably most beneficial in phases 1 and 4, where the other two there's some benefits there. But the idea here is this: you have these imaginary conversations with nature, where students take on the role of a part of nature in order to understand human impact, right? So somebody can say, like, I'm going to be the polar bear, right? I'm just thinking about what happens in the schools right now, okay? It's not a great example, maybe there's better examples, but it's unfortunately has become sort of a classic example of the way in which we're hurting the planet and is hurting polar bears, which is really happening to polar bears. So if polar bears could talk to us, what would they actually say? What would be their arguments? What would be the words that they would say around the experiences that they're having, right? Now you might think this is kind of silly, but try it, right? Give it a real solid effort. If you think it's silly, give it a real solid effort on your part as a teacher and see where kids go with it. It's going to bring a lot out. When you finally get to a space where it's not just silly anymore, Um, having a kid imagine that they're the sky and talking about their experience with global warming, it sounds silly at first maybe, but it's imaginative. It's a little playful, but it's actually humanizing it in a way, not in a way to anthropocize it. We don't. If we have sort of an anthropomorphize it, um, what we're really doing here is it gives us a way to understand things better if it's anthropomorphized. It gives us much more of a deeper human connection that we can relate to. It's for our sake to relate to now, but it's not to make it anthropocentric, which means that we keep putting human priorities over everybody else's in nature. I don't mean it with that intention. I mean it with just giving us the ability to understand it more deeply. Okay. Now, inquiry in general, I've taught with inquiry quite a bit, and worked at the Connecticut Science Center in its early stages, and we used the Exploratorium model, not the 5E model. We intentionally chose Exploratorium model for that for a good reason. I can't go through it. This is something that takes a lot of time to explain, so let me just do the quick here, which is that there's some basic stages. You have an exploration phase, you have an investigations phase, which are two different things. Exploration is sort of the initial, like, hey, what's this about? And then after you've had that exploration, you turn it into a much more formal investigation or experiment, right? If we're talking about it in terms of a science class. But it more broadly doesn't have to be an experiment. It can just be an investigation for other content areas. When you do this investigation, you come up with some data, and you analyze it. You look for patterns. You communicate those patterns, and we can do community engagement with this in both ways, right? We can talk about this in ways of learning from the community as well as contributing to the community. So a lot more there than I can get into at this particular moment, but you get the idea, okay? Look up the Exploratorium model for inquiry. Now, deliberation is something I talk about, especially in opposition to debates. If you're teaching towards thriving, debates is highly questionable method. I don't think it serves a person that people oftentimes think that it does. Debate is competitive, it's entrenching. Even if you're trying to get somebody to take, to argue a point that they don't actually feel like they're in favor of, I mean, that's just weird and at all. I mean, I wouldn't torture somebody like that. But it ends up being about winning as opposed to the really meaningful points and experiences that we might be having, right? That's a very diluted way of dealing with an issue. Whereas deliberation is about working together to come to what could be a solution with that problem in mind, right? So deliberation is much deeper, and it's not something that would happen in phase one in any real way. It would definitely be a phase two kind of experience. And then, as I talked about in the beginning, deliberation is part of the community-based experiences, right? So deliberating towards solutions, okay? Coming up with some decisions of what might be able to be done, right? Cooperative groups is the students working in groups where each student takes on a unique task. So we oftentimes think about, put kids into small groups, have them work together, on whatever, a prompt or a reading or something like that. And then cooperative groups is a little bit different, where in the group everybody has a unique task that they're responsible for. Timekeepers, note takers, and all that kind of stuff, right? It tends to be these really superficial kind of tasks. It's more sort of procedural and process oriented kind of tasks. But what happens if it's towards thriving? So, we all have our paths and our strengths. So why couldn't we, one, use in the cooperative group the shifting of critical lenses, right? Somebody's responsible for a specific critical lens. That's their contribution to the group, is thinking about things through their lens. Or two, whatever, if we've been spending time in a significant way of helping kids to figure out what they think that their paths are, coming from the perspective of their individual paths, right? And I think that would be really powerful to have kids talking about it from a path orientation, right? So, could you do this at I don't have 3 or 4 highlighted here. Could you do it at those levels? You certainly could. But I think they're probably most efficiently or effectively used in phases 1 or 2. Small group discussion. Students working in groups, often with guided prompts that sets up for the whole group discussion. So small group is usually a precursor to the whole group. Small group is different than cooperative groups in the sense that cooperative groups have the unique task or responsibility assigned to a student in the more traditional sense, right? In the thriving sense, it's more about being responsible for a critical lens or their own path, oriented view, right? Their own analysis through their paths. Whereas small group discussion is different because you don't have those direct responsibilities. It might be for a very different purpose. Maybe we're all looking at things from a same perspective, but we're not like directly responsible for some part of it. Okay. Obviously, small group discussions are going to happen in phase 4. Breakout groups and all that. It could be a small group thing. I don't have it highlighted here, but obviously it is something that could be part of a phase 4 experience, right? Whole group discussion obviously is going to be part of a phase 4 experience too. But when we're talking about it, using it in terms of it being useful for learning, right? That dynamic between the small group to the whole group, they're really in partnership with one another. A cooperative group to the whole group also in partnership with one another. So here it's obviously students working in small groups are guided with prompts set up for the whole group, right? So the small group is setting up the whole group, as I said before, and then we get together and what's the purpose of the whole group, right? Is it just to be like, okay, I just need you to get the small group so that you can do this kind of work and then get the right answers to me? Or is it that we really want to see what kind of patterns form when we get to the whole group? So if it's for the purpose of thriving, you really want to be more focused on patterns. Okay. Same would be true at the phase 4 level if you were to do the kind of work there. Okay. Patterns. Direct instruction and lecture, right? It's kind of the same thing. It's what I'm doing right now. It actually can be a very effective tool for kids. You can't overuse it, right? Obviously, they're gonna get, if you're still in the video watching this, you're crazy right now, right? There's a lot that I've been anyway. Yeah, it's easy. We're not built for this. Okay, just to hear somebody go on and on and on for as long as I have, we're not built for this. This is not the best way to teach, and it's not the best way to learn. However, there are times in small doses when we do have to explain something. So it can be really effective, especially when there's no one in the room who really can do it except for you, the teacher. Okay, I use it a lot as a teacher because I get into some pretty complicated thinking that is just, it's not initially there for my students, and that's okay. And it's not a judgment of them in any way, shape, or form. It's just where things are at. But I do this because sometimes it's just a lot more effective to say these things out loud rather than try to work with some other method to kind of get there. Right? Sometimes. Rainbow of Desire. Okay, we're almost done here. I have a set of theater-based activities that you can use in the classroom. It gets people up and moving, and it gets them acting. And I've been part of these different kinds of activities, experiences, and they're awesome. Really, really, really awesome. So Rainbow of Desire is Okay, so you set up a scenario, and somebody sort of introduces it as an actor. They share whatever that situation is and what they're, I don't want to say initially feeling, because that's really up to the rest of the audience to figure out. So, rainbow, right? Taking, if you think about the metaphor there, you have white light going through a prism and breaking up into all the different colors. Same thing is true here. We have a situation, and now we're going to pause it and see all the different bands of thinking that are happening pretty much at the same time or really close to one another. Maybe they might be sequential, one leads to the other. But what we want to do is look at the ways in which thinking, all the diverse ways of thinking, is happening with that one situation. And then the question is like, whoa, why are we thinking it that way? Or why are we thinking it this way? How about that new thing you just said? Where's that coming from? But what you first want to do is get all the different ways of thinking out there and record them in some way so you can go back through them. Okay? Now, that's sort of a broad, uh, uh, pardon the pun, a broad way of dealing with an issue. Theater activity, Broadway, get it? Here's a little bit more of a specific one. This one is called The Cop in My Head, and it's an activity that's kind of comes from Rainbow of Desires, but it's a specific kind of thinking that we do, which is how do we hold ourselves back in our own thinking? What are our fears? What are our concerns? What are our anxieties? And how do they play into what we're going to actually do about something? So we have this like cop that's in our head that's keeping us from doing something, right? Holding us back. Okay. Sorry if you're a police officer. I know it's if you're doing your job well, it's not about holding people back. I get it. It's about protecting people, right? And that's kind of the metaphor here. Is how do we think that we're protecting ourselves from whatever the fears, anxieties, and concerns are around that. Now this is another one in my head activity, but it's actually really quite different than cop in my head. This one's called corporation in my head. Corporation in my head is how is the corporation affecting my thinking? So if I go and do this thing, how is it that I've been sort of trained by profit-oriented businesses, right, to behave? Okay, so that they're trying to get me to do what? So I have this here, corporation in my head, for Disney addicts. Now, you've seen a lot of where Disney has gone wrong, and I've only sort of touched upon that in this unit. Uh, but really think about this. For people who are addicted to Disney, there's something of a conversation to be had there, right? Given that there's so much problematic content in Disney itself, I haven't even gotten into gender issues or heteronormativity, class-based issues. What is up with the rich people everywhere, right? There's a lot of rich stories. There's a lot of wealth stories. The castle itself, right? I mean, what is our fascination with feudalism? Like, come on already. So you get the idea. There's a lot of storytelling in Disney. It's for-profit business, like every other for-profit business. So what's going on here, and why are people so addicted to Disney? Now, I think there's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek going on here, right? The Disney addicts understand, right? It's sort of like a haha, I'm an addict, but you might actually be like a real addict when it comes to it. And the fact that they turn the mouse ears, sort of into a heart, like they're not that different in shape, they're similar in shape. Yeah, there's a lot going on here, folks. So something to be, I if I was to do a class-based analysis, a classism analysis on Disney, there's a whole lot going on in Disney that is classism. Now, if you look at sort of some of the newer movies and whatnot, maybe there's something there that is calling that out and purposely changing those orientations, maybe. Okay. Um, so, yeah, Disney is the biggest storyteller for kids on the planet, which is why I'm using that in this here. But corporation in my head, what is Disney trying to get you to do? Because obviously they want you to hand over money, and they have lots of our money, because we all hand over our money to Disney, myself included. So how is it that they're doing that? What's in our head that's getting us to want to keep doing that? For some people, it's this return to innocence, right? Disney is not innocent. And it really doesn't represent innocence and this sort of pure happiness. Um, it's a business, right? So if we do some sort of critical analysis of that, it's not that we shouldn't ever enjoy Disney. It's that maybe we should be a little more in control of our thinking, and maybe we should be a little more cautious as to what we consume and what we back. When we consume something, we're backing it, right? It's in a way, it's like a capitalist vote. So what's going on here in our own selves with that, right? So we could do a scene with corporation in my head. We could do a Disney scene, for instance, right? Have somebody get up there and I don't know, pick a scene from a movie, and then, or we could have a toy. We could, yeah, that's the other thing too. Is we could just literally put a toy on a table, and then start to one by one. People go up and say what their thinking is about that toy, and in other words, what the corporations want. This corporation, Disney, wants us to think about with this toy sitting on the table, right? Like, I'm not gonna even joke. I love Stitch, so that would like hurt my heart to have to do a critical analysis of Stitch. Okay, but anyway, right? We can do that kind of stuff, and we'll be okay. We'll be okay. I'll be okay. We'll be okay. We're okay, right? But isn't it interesting that Disney has that kind of grip on us, whereas some other industries, other companies don't even come close to whatever Disney does. So what's it tapping into? Really interesting there. Form theater. Form theater is quite complex, and I can't really do it justice there. You see the link there. Click on the link. You'll get more information. But basically, what we're doing is what Augusto Boal calls the rehearsal for life. So we have a real issue in our society, and we're role playing it in front of one another. So it's something that is going on in our community, but we're gonna role play it so we can see if it's possible to change the outcome. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, and if it isn't, that's just as interesting as if it is. Why isn't it changeable, right? So you have the situation going on, and you have people acting as the antagonist who's creating the injustice, and you have the protagonists are people who are there to try to confront the injustice. And so you have somebody called a Joker who helps run this scene, and they can call timeout. They can say, does it seem like it's real enough? Is it too exaggerative? Is it are we doing magical thinking here, right? Where we snap our fingers, it just goes away. So a Joker is a really helpful person in this process because they sort of call out when we might go off the rails a bit. And then you have people who are in the audience as spectators, right? But they're not just spectators, they're also actors. They can call out freeze and say, I would like to replace the protagonist, right? I want to replace so-and-so. Let me see if I can do it this way, right? So you rerun the scene and you try out the new way that the person comes in with and see what that outcome might be. And again, the Joker can sort of say, hey, do we have this in a real way, or are we just engaging in magical thinking here, right? All right. In terms of methods, this is the last one. Homework, and I put home in quotes. The idea is that not to just keep engaging in this sort of skill and drill method of homework, right? Got to get the skill done. Got to get the skill done. Got to get the skill done. The idea here is that we go home, wherever home is, whoever's there with us at home, and we have these discussions about whatever the topic is at home, at school. Sorry. So we go home, and let's say today's topic was on subtleties of racism in Disney, right? Okay, so we're gonna now I'm gonna have this conversation at home and say hey, we were talking about this thing and that thing, and what do you think about this? Do you think that that's what's going on? And there's gonna be a range of responses to it, right? Some people are gonna be like, oh my God, yeah, totally, and all the way to the other opposite end, like, oh, come on, that's not important, blah, 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 right? That's really interesting to see the range of responses that we get in, uh, fairly non-judgmental ways. We would just want to collect it basically as data. And we don't want to put our loved ones constantly on the line of like criticizing them for whatever responses that they give. But when we go back to school, it's really interesting to look at the patterns that come up when everybody goes home and asks their loved ones and other community members that they know, what do they think about this, right? So homework is literally about going to the community and learning from the community when we ask the kind of questions that we're asking in class. Okay? Now, closure. Okay. If you're still with me, good gravy. Good for you. Closure is really just about implications. I know we oftentimes talk about it in terms of find out what the students know. That's the purpose of closure, is to find out what the students know. Well, look, if you've been, thoughtful as a teacher, you've been finding out what students know the whole time. It shouldn't just be this one last experience that kind of gets you there. Now, it can be very helpful to do that. But let's broaden this out even more. What are the implications of actually knowing this, having this new skill, concept, understanding at all, right? So it's really about implications. You can do this, again, just like you did with initiation, right? Stop with the exit slips. The exit slips are a terrible, mundane way of teaching. They're not effective. I've seen exit slips done over and over and over and over. Once in a while, you're like, ooh, yeah, I'm getting some information here. But exit slips are written almost with this specific intended purpose of, exclusive intended purpose of, do my kids know the content that I talked about today? Do my students know the content? And that's what they, or the skill or the process or whatever it is that we're teaching them about. Do they know it? And so I do this little, here's a bunch of slips of paper, fill it out, and then give it to me anonymously because I just really just want to know blah, blah, blah. Or maybe you have them put their names on it because you want them to have some level of accountability. I didn't get so-and-so, so I even need you to put your name on it. Whatever, fine, okay, got it. What are you really finding out, right? If you're waiting until the exit slips to find out if they actually got this stuff, it's too late. Your lesson didn't work, right? The adjustments should be made in real time, and by the end of whatever the experience was today, you should have a good idea. You should be checking in and having a strong sense of where things are at, not just waiting until the end. Now, I get it. It's a convenient way of understanding something, but if you're a student, how many times a day do you want to see an exit slip? How many times a day are you going to take an exit slip seriously? If a teacher says, it's okay if you don't know something, you can write down that you don't know it. Oh, awesome. Sweet. Thank you. Right? So if I'm not really engaged in this class, I can just put down, I don't know. It's not great in terms of a method. Even when it's done well, it's still kind of just meh. Right? So in closing a lesson up, why not run, basically like you did initiation, run closure with it. Provide yet another example and let students do something with it in an abbreviated way, granted, right? So, same sort of stuff, right? So here's the closure. The closure is, look at these patterns. What do you see here? You see Mufasa and Scar, who are brothers. What's going on here? Remember, we're talking about subtleties and racism. And I know, for the Disney fans who are watching this, they're like, ha, you don't have anything that's sort of up to date. Well, and maybe you can even say this is not up to date, but the fact that Disney keeps doing stuff with The Lion King, whether it's a play, a live action film, means that it is kind of up to date. So, alright, anyway, I have a PhD. There is no na. So what are the patterns here? Well, look at their tones. Their fur is different. Their manes are significantly different, and even their fur tones are different. Their regular fur, right? It's both, in both cases, they're darker for Scar. He's the villain. Oh, here we go again, right? Making the dark person the villain. They're brothers. How is this possible that they would have such a significant range, a significant difference like that, especially when one is the villain of the movie? Well, okay, here we go again, right? These implicit biases that keep popping up. The other thing, what's interesting, is that Scar has a different accent than does Mufasa, right? James Earl Jones versus, oh, I just dropped the actor's head in my, it's gone. Anyway, but you have this difference in their accents. They're brothers. That seems weird, right? Unless they spent their entire life apart and there was a different accent set going on. Anyway, so even an quote unquote accent is at play here, right? Which we know is part of some hardcore racism. So if you look at the pattern, right, here we are. There's the evil, darker, hurting and killing Mufasa. Oop, spoiler. Sorry about that. Okay. Now, if you have that relationship going on, does this play out in regular life? How do subtle racisms find themselves in not so subtle ways? Do we have parallels but in not so subtle ways, right? So this was something that, if you go back in time, the white supremacy was definitely rearing its very ugly head during Obama presidency. And it was building during those 8 years, right? And here you go. Here's an example of real world white supremacy going on. The villain is darker. The Uncle Sam is being threatened with his life right here. A very muscular Uncle Sam, I might say, but another story for another day. And you have white supremacists walking around talking about Obama's plan as white slavery, right? And as we know, this grew and was fueled by the next president and all the ways that played out all the way up to January 6th and beyond, right? It's not done yet. January 6th, 2021 with the insurrection on the Capitol. Right, so you have Confederate flags, you have Nazi flags, and you have Trump being associated with all of these things by his white supremacist supporters, and him being very complacent. Yes, please, no, you can't do this, no, please, right? And of course, supporters who are white supremacists know that he has to say those things from their point of view. They know that he has to say these things, but he's saying them with such indifference or low energy, right? I mean, he's one who talks about other politicians being low energy. Well, he's super low energy when it comes to this particular issue. So you see the cartoon there with tut tut, don't do that, okay guys, you shouldn't be doing this kind of a tone, right? So yeah, there's this interesting through line. Now I'm not saying that Disney has some sort of liability when it comes to this level of extremism. But it is interesting that these implicit biases are present in our society, and how when they become expanded out, how it plays out in our society. So yeah, anyway, right? Like Disney is not engaging in this sort of over explicit white supremacy, but right? There's a little bit of that. There's hints of that kind of stuff going on in Disney, which is like, whoa, right? So again, you Disney lovers, check it at the door, right? Be aware of what's going on. All right. Last but not least, this is where I'm ending, right? Avoid mundane learning experiences, please. I'm begging you on behalf of all of our students. School learning should not be mundane. Do not kill learning, right? What are the ways in which this happens? Exit slips. I can't stress this enough, right? These things are mundane, to say the least. KWL charts, right? I can list off teaching method after teaching method. You get the idea. There are lots of teaching methods that are very mundane and sort of life draining. Long, direct instruction. Look, I just did this for the sake of a video. Don't kill me, okay? Seems like a contradiction. I get it. I'm more just putting it out there so it's there for people to have access to. Come and go as you please, right? Learning that ends at the right answers. We have to stop teaching to just the right answers as if that's the end point for learning. PowerPoint presentations as a primary tool. Again, don't kill me for being a contradiction to myself here, but you see this in the classrooms a lot where PowerPoints are, it's just instead of writing on the board, now we're just putting it onto PowerPoints and everybody's got to either copy it or save it and then learn from it. I mean, that is mundane. We know that, right? When we use slideshows like PowerPoint, they really should be helpful and engaging. We should be doing a lot more work with visuals and less with text. Okay. Anyway, homework for homework's sake. That's why I have homework, home in quotes. Debates, talked about that. 5-paragraph essay style. We've had discussions around this for years. It's a structure, and it can be helpful in the beginning, but for the love of God, don't limit kids to that, and don't be so repetitive with it, okay? Overuse of nonfiction, we know that we're dealing with that right now, thank you, Common Core. And then the use of competition in the classroom. Oh my God, that had to be about 17 hours, so I hope that was helpful, okay? Obviously there's a few things in there that I have to fix, but I'll get there. The slideshow link will be in the description. Right? That is it. Holy schmoly, we are really done here. I am done. All right, take care. Bye bye.